before we get into the absolute basics of photography, let's take a little walk through history first and see where did the camera come from. The first device able to reproduce and capture an image was invented in 1816 by Joseph Nicephore Niepce. It was called the heliograph. The world's oldest surviving photograph is View from the Window at Lagrange, taken in 1826 or 1827. The photograph was taken using a technique called heliography, which involves treating metal plates with light-sensitive chemicals to create unique images. Then there was this picture. In 1839, American photographer Robert Cornelius took the first ever portrait photograph of a person. He removed the lens cap, ran into the frame, and stood still for 10 minutes before returning the cap to its position. While he simply wanted to capture the image of a human, Cornelius couldn't have even been aware that he was pioneering a technique that would be perfected by millennials 170 years later. The selfie. Good thing we don't have to try and use metal plates or chemicals anymore, because I guarantee you there'd be a lot of messed up fingers just from all the chemicals. Because, yeah, good luck. Good thing all we have to do is, what? Press a button? Or do we? No, that is wrong. There are 3 things that we need to cover that will make up a photograph. First is the shutter speed, also known as exposure time. It's the length of time that a camera shutter is open to let in light that hits the sensor. Much like when you open a blind in your house, that shutter stays open and that light hits that back wall for a certain amount of time and then closes. Now, there is fast shutter speed and then there's slow shutter speed. Fast shutter speed is more used when you're trying to shoot a subject that is either in motion or going across your field of view really fast. And you want to be able to take that picture where there isn't any motion blur while it's moving. Otherwise, that image is going to be a little softer, or that image is going to look just out of focus. So when you're shooting fast, that image is going to be so much sharper, and you're going to capture that moment in time so that it looks as if everything was frozen. For slow shutter speeds, what it does is that shutter is going to open a lot slower and closes a lot slower. So the amount of light coming in is actually more extensive because it's hitting the sensor for a longer period of time. Like when you see those light trails on cars, or you see something blurring across the screen, that's because that shutter is staying open for longer. Now we can move on to the second thing, aperture. Now this has to do with the amount of light coming through the lens into your camera. The aperture is actually inside the lens. You're looking at some of these blades that are actually on the inside of this lens, and they will open and close. Now, you're able to control that light, so you have what is known as stops of light inside that lens. As you can see in this picture right here, everything is in focus. Everything looks like it was shot with the intention of the background being in focus and your subject being in focus. And that is fantastic for landscapes or things where you want to capture everything at the same time where nothing is blurred out. So you don't have as much light coming in through that lens hitting your sensor. Now, when you're shooting more wide open, like you see in this picture, you can actually see that everything starts to blend into the background from your subject. So you can isolate your subject from everything else, and you can make everything nice and blurred out and a lot softer so that the eye is drawn to your subject. Sometimes you'll see lenses that are more in the 1.2 to 1.8 or 2.8. And they're much more conducive in the nighttime, darker places where you're going to be able to allow that aperture to go wide open so that you can allow as much light as you can to come in. But when you're closing that aperture, you're going to have to allow that shutter speed be a lot slower, because now you have to allow the shutter to stay open longer so that it can compensate to allow for your lens to actually close off, almost like a tunnel's closing off and not allowing as much light to come through. Otherwise, if you don't compensate with your shutter, you're gonna end up with a lot darker image. That is why there are so many lenses out there that have so many different ranges of stops of light so that you can control in that environment the light coming into your camera, whether it be sports photography or landscape photography or photography in certain conditions such as studio lighting, or are you outside, or are you more in a dark space, sometimes astrophotography, right? So you're gonna have to be able to find out, okay, there is a lens that suits your specific need. Now this leads us to the third part, which is ISO. This will complete what is also known as the exposure triangle. Think of ISO as fake light or a lamp inside your camera that you're dimming or you're cranking so that you can get light that wasn't there before to show up in your image. Now, there isn't actually a light inside your camera, but this image is a little bit darker, so I'm gonna brighten it up a little bit. But if you're like outside, you can't exactly turn down the sun, or you can't exactly turn up the sun. You're not playing with the sunlight, you're playing with that light inside the camera to say, okay, I have my aperture set and I have my shutter speed set. How am I gonna control that light? Well, there is a button for that you can turn up or turn down, but what that will also introduce into your images is what is called as noise or grain. It's the type of grain that you can see almost like little black dots. So a lot of times with ISO, when you're maybe shooting action photography and you're in the 100 to 200 range, you're gonna get a lot less grain in your footage because you're not introducing that fake light into that image. But when you start getting up more into the 700 and 800, 900 range, you may be introducing a little bit more grain into those shadows. Now, it can really depend on how much grain do you want. And a lot of times you're gonna need to experiment with ISO, aperture, and shutter speed so that you can start to really understand how to control that light inside your camera. Now, different cameras have different ISO settings, so not all cameras are created equally when it comes to ISO. Theirs is the base ISO that each camera has that it shoots with, both in the video and in the photography portion of things, where it operates at its nominal point so that even if you're shooting in, let's say, the 800 ISO range, such as this Canon camera, it's exactly where the manufacturer said this is where it's supposed to be when shooting video. Now, I change it over to manual mode when I'm shooting photographs, and I base it on what is the situation telling me to do. I don't have it set exactly every single time because a lot of times that light is doing all sorts of different things, especially when I'm outside doing landscape or I'm doing portrait or doing something that requires that I play with that triangle so I can get the perfect image, because each portion of that triangle you're going to be pushing, pulling, and it's gonna create that image that you're looking for. So hit that like button if you like this video, subscribe, and you know what? Subscribing is free, just like your neighbor's Wi-Fi. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.